The lights dimmed at the Democratic National Convention. Across the polished stage, the screens flashed a montage of hope and struggle, curated, of course, for maximum emotional impact. And then she appeared. Michelle Obama, draped in designer fabric worth more than most Americans made in a year, standing tall beneath a banner that read, "Hope, Change, Progress." The crowd erupted in orchestrated applause. The media swooned. Twitter ignited. And for one brief, manufactured moment, the myth lived again. The Obamas, America's saviors, stepping forward to remind the nation what grace looked like. Except it was all a lie. Somewhere far from the gleaming stage in a modest living room cluttered with overdue bills and forgotten dreams, a father changed the channel. He had believed once. Believed in the slogans, the promises, the carefully crafted image of a man who would heal the nation and lift up the forgotten. But belief had given way to bitterness, and bitterness had given way to the cold, hard facts. Because while America suffered, while middle-class jobs evaporated, while communities crumbled under waves of addiction and hopelessness, Barack and Michelle Obama had flourished, not as public servants, not as humble patriots, but as royalty, gilded in book deals, Netflix contracts, speaking fees that could fund entire school districts. They had become what they once claimed to despise, the elite, the untouchable, the very embodiment of the power structures they once promised to dismantle. Michelle's voice rang out from the television, smooth and carefully measured. "When they go low, we go high." It was the line everyone remembered, the line everyone quoted, the line that now tasted like ash. Because outside the insulated bubble of donors and Ivy League sycophants, Americans weren't going high. They were barely surviving. Inflation gnawed at every paycheck. Crime infested the neighborhoods politicians abandoned. Children grew up in broken schools while the Obamas signed publishing deals for millions. And somewhere deep inside, the American people knew. Hope had been a product, change had been a slogan, and progress had been reserved for the few. Michelle's smile didn't waver. Her cadence didn't falter. She spoke of compassion, of unity, of sacrifice, and every word dripped with the kind of practiced insincerity that could only be honed through years of cashing in on other people's pain. There were no stumbles, no accidental truths, only the well-oiled machine of a legacy being scrubbed, polished, and repackaged for another decade of monetization. Meanwhile, behind the cameras, far from the teleprompters and choreographed standing ovations, reality loomed. The Obama Presidential Library, the crown jewel of their post-presidency empire, a monument not to public service, but to self-glorification. A billion-dollar mausoleum rising from the south side of Chicago, financed by corporate donors and public funds under the thinnest veneer of giving back. Except there were no presidential documents stored inside, no public archives for historians, no sacred trust with the American people. It was an empty shell, a vanity project, a temple to ambition masquerading as altruism. The scandal barely made a ripple in mainstream media. After all, questioning the Obamas was heresy. But the facts were stubborn things. The National Archives revealed that, despite years of promises, Barack Obama hadn't turned over a single official document to be housed at his so-called library. Not one. Instead, American taxpayers were now on the hook for more than $1.4 million a year, just to maintain digital records hosted on government servers. Obama kept the accolades, the naming rights, the carefully curated image of benevolence, and the public got the bill. Michelle's voice rose, reaching for another crescendo. She spoke of equity, of leveling the playing field, of lifting up every voice. The crowd roared. The cameras zoomed in on teary-eyed delegates clutching hope signs. And somewhere, maybe even inside herself, Michelle Obama believed the performance. Believed that no matter how far she had drifted from the humble beginnings she often invoked, she could still wear the costume of authenticity and be applauded for it. But belief and reality were diverging, and outside the convention bubble, that divergence was becoming impossible to ignore. In Chicago, the construction crews building the Obama Library fought through delays, budget overruns, and public protests. The once pristine project site had become a symbol of everything wrong with modern America. corruption, cronyism, empty virtue signaling wrapped in billion-dollar contracts. The library wasn't a beacon of community revitalization. It was a fortress of exclusion. It displaced local residents. It devoured public parkland. It funneled lucrative construction jobs to politically connected firms under the banner of diversity hiring. It was the perfect monument to the Obama's true legacy: image over substance, profit over people, optics over obligation. Back at the convention, Michelle closed her speech with another thunderous applause line. Democracy is on the ballot. The crowd erupted. The media fawned. And across America, millions of ordinary citizens switched off their TVs and shook their heads. Not because they hated Michelle, not because they harbored resentment or bigotry, but because they recognized the same con that had been running for years, the same smiling faces, the same hollow promises, the same enrichment of the few at the expense of the many. Hope had been bought and sold, change had been monetized, progress had been outsourced, and the Obamas had been its most skillful merchants. They didn't build bridges, they built brands. They didn't empower the powerless, they empowered themselves. They didn't lead a movement, they managed a market. Michelle Obama left the stage to roaring ovation, bathed in spotlights, draped in borrowed authenticity, and behind her, in the shadows of the stadium she had just electrified, the cracks grew wider, the illusion grew thinner, and the reckoning grew closer. Because somewhere beyond the gilded stages and curated montages, a different America stirred, an America that had stopped believing, an America that had started remembering, an America that understood finally that the real hope wasn't found in a speech. It was found in exposing the truth. And the truth was simple. The Obamas hadn't gone high. They had gone home, to mansions, to millionaire, to the very empire they once claimed to stand against. The Obama Presidential Center was supposed to be a monument to hope. It was supposed to stand as a shining beacon on Chicago's South Side, a living testament to a presidency that, according to its architects, had changed the very soul of America. It was supposed to honor the grassroots spirit, the working families, the everyday citizens who had dared to believe in something bigger than themselves. That was the sales pitch. The reality? A billion-dollar vanity project carved into stolen parkland, displacing the very communities it claimed to uplift. An architectural mausoleum to self-worship, a temple not to democracy, but to ego. From the beginning, something smelled wrong. The groundbreaking ceremony was a choreographed spectacle, heavy on symbolism and light on substance. Politicians paraded across the stage, gushing about inclusion, equity, community revitalization, the same buzzwords that had long ago been drained of meaning. The local residents clapped politely. They had no choice. Their homes were already being priced out. Their parks were already being bulldozed. Their voices had already been ignored. Behind the dazzling renderings and the soaring speeches, the truth festered. The Obama Library wasn't a library at all. It was a privately controlled entity, immune from federal oversight. No official presidential documents, no historical archives, just a tourist attraction, a brand extension, a museum of curated nostalgia designed to immortalize a sanitized version of history. And yet, taxpayers still footed the bill. $1.4 million a year, siphoned quietly from the federal budget, to maintain digital servers housing carefully vetted records, while the actual physical documents languished in a nondescript warehouse far from public view. They called it the People's Library, but the people weren't allowed inside. Not really. They weren't consulted on the design. They weren't invited to the decision tables. They were told what to celebrate and when to applaud. And if they dared to question the wisdom of building $1 billion shrine to a former president in a struggling neighborhood, they were labeled as traitors to progress, racists, reactionaries, bigots clinging to the past. Because in the world of the Obamas, opposition wasn't disagreement, it was heresy. As construction dragged on, the cracks grew harder to hide. Budgets ballooned, deadlines slipped, contractors padded invoices, cloaked under the guise of diversity initiatives and social equity mandates. Projects that should have cost thousands suddenly cost millions. Permits were rushed, Inspections were waved through. Environmental reviews were buried under layers of bureaucratic jargon. Local families watched helplessly as their beloved parks transformed into restricted zones, fenced off and guarded by private security. They weren't participants in this renaissance. They were casualties, collateral damage in a public relations war they never signed up for. In private boardrooms, the real architects of the Obama Center toasted their success. Consultants, developers, corporate sponsors whose names were etched discreetly into the donor walls hidden behind the main exhibits. Google, Netflix, Goldman Sachs, the very titans of wealth and influence Barack Obama once railed against. Now they were partners, patrons, co-conspirators in the great laundering of a legacy. Because the library wasn't about preserving history, it was about controlling it, rewriting it, selling it. One overpriced ticket, one keynote speech, one self-congratulatory gala at a time. Outside the gleaming construction fences, the neighborhoods crumbled. The promises of economic revitalization proved as empty as the archives themselves. Jobs went to out-of-town contractors. Housing prices soared beyond reach. Generational families, the bedrock of the South Side, were pushed out in favor of gentrified condos and boutique cafes. The displacement was sanitized in glossy pamphlets as urban renewal, the erasure of a community disguised as opportunity. And through it all, the Obamas smiled, posing for magazine covers, hosting Netflix premieres, cashing seven-figure checks for speeches on public service. Meanwhile, the architectural monstrosity itself grew uglier by the day. What was sold as a beacon of light morphed into a bloated concrete monolith, towering arrogantly over the battered landscape like a corporate fortress. Locals joked bitterly that it looked less like a library and more like a dystopian headquarters from a science fiction nightmare. And perhaps that was fitting, because what better symbol could there be for the modern political elite than a hollow fortress of broken promises, funded by the people they abandoned and guarded against the scrutiny of those they betrayed? As delays mounted and scandals simmered, the media circled protectively around the project. Criticism was muted. Investigations were soft-pedaled. Every controversy was framed as growing pains. Every protest was dismissed as right-wing noise. The narrative was sacrosanct. Barack and Michelle Obama were untouchable. Their brand had to be protected at all costs, even if it meant silencing the very voices they claimed to champion. Then came the blow no one expected. The lease, the land the Obama Center stood on, the very foundation of their billion-dollar empire, was not fully owned. It was leased. And that lease had conditions. Conditions that, thanks to a few stubborn watchdogs and one particularly uncooperative billionaire, were about to become a very big problem. Elon Musk, the man the Obamas had quietly mocked behind closed doors, the man they dismissed as a sideshow, a useful idiot when he played nice with green energy narratives, and a dangerous threat when he dared to speak freely. He wasn't playing anymore. He was watching, and he was waiting. And when the moment came, when the Obamas overreached one contract too far, Musk struck, hard, and for the first time since the groundbreaking ceremony, the Obamas realized they weren't as untouchable as they thought, but that reckoning was still coming. For now, the cracks in the empire spread, the foundation shook, and behind the manicured lawns and curated press releases, the truth festered like a wound. The Obama Presidential Center was not a gift. It was a monument to betrayal, a shrine to self-interest, a fortress built on broken promises and bulldozed dreams. And no amount of speeches, documentaries, or staged interviews could hide it anymore. Because the people were waking up, the illusion was dying, and the empire of vanity was crumbling, brick by billion-dollar brick. It began with a letter, not a press conference, not a viral tweet, not a carefully staged confrontation for maximum social media engagement. Just a simple, devastating letter. Delivered quietly to the offices managing the Obama Presidential Center's lease agreements. Signed by Elon Musk. Short, precise, lethal. The message was clear. The terms had been violated. The lease was null and void, and the illusion began to die. For months, Musk had watched from a distance, watched as the Obamas paraded their project across television screens, Netflix specials, and celebrity gala circuits. Watched as they spun a narrative of hope and progress, built atop the rubble of broken communities. Watched as critics were silenced, protesters smeared, dissent buried beneath mountains of crafted goodwill. He had seen enough. This wasn't charity. It wasn't legacy building. It was a corporate takeover of memory itself, a hostile rewrite of history disguised as philanthropy, and it was time someone pulled the mask off. The reaction was instantaneous. Panic erupted inside the Obama Foundation. Emergency meetings convened behind closed doors. Crisis managers dialed each other at 2 in the morning. Lawyers pored over the lease terms, desperate to find loopholes, escape hatches, technicalities. There were none. The violations were clear. The requirements for public access, for genuine community benefit, for environmental compliance, had been ignored, skirted, or outright defied. In their arrogance, the Obamas had believed the rules didn't apply to them. That branding could override contracts. That symbolism could erase obligations. They were wrong, and Musk had called their bluff. Media allies scrambled to control the narrative. CNN floated vague reports about right-wing interference. MSNBC whispered about billionaire revenge plots. The New York Times editorialized that certain individuals were weaponizing bureaucracy against progress. But it didn't work, because the documents spoke louder than spin, and the American people had grown deaf to the old siren songs of manufactured outrage. Behind the polished facades, Michelle Obama fumed. Barack seethed. They weren't used to losing. They weren't used to being challenged. And they certainly weren't used to being outmaneuvered by a man who, in their social circles, was dismissed as a joke one year and feared as a threat the next. Meanwhile, Musk moved in silence. No interviews, no victory laps, just relentless precision. Lawyers filed injunctions, auditors unearthed discrepancies. Whistleblowers, emboldened by the shifting tides, stepped forward. Stories emerged of misallocated funds, crony contracting, environmental violations swept under the rug. The carefully curated myth of the Obama Center began to unravel thread by thread. And with each revelation, the foundations cracked deeper. Community groups that had once been strong-armed into silence now found their voice. Lawsuits piled up. Petitions flooded city councils. Local activists took to the streets, not against Musk, but against the empire that had stolen their parks, their homes, their dreams. They chanted slogans once reserved for corrupt corporations and cynical politicians. This is not hope. This is theft. Stop the scam. Take back our land. The irony was delicious. The progressive icon of a generation brought low by the very grassroots energy he had once harnessed so skillfully. Inside the polished conference rooms of the Obama Foundation, desperation reigned. Plans were drafted to reframe the narrative, to recast Musk as an enemy of the people, a threat to democracy, a billionaire bully crushing a sacred project. But every attempt backfired because the facts were too damning. And because at the end of the day, Elon Musk had something the Obamas had squandered. Credibility. He wasn't perfect. Far from it. But he wasn't a fraud. He didn't preach humility while cashing billion-dollar checks for ghost-written memoirs. He didn't claim to fight for the common man while lounging in Martha's Vineyard estates bought with Netflix money. He was who he said he was. Flawed, blunt, relentless. And at least in this fight, unmistakably right. Meanwhile, the Obama Center stood silent. Construction slowed, donations dried up, tours were canceled, sponsors reconsidered, and beneath the weight of public scrutiny, the once invincible edifice of curated legacy began to crumble. Television pundits, once loyal disciples, began asking uncomfortable questions. Why weren't the documents housed there? Where did the money go? Why did community leaders feel betrayed? For the first time in years, the protective bubble around Barack and Michelle showed cracks. For the first time, the myth wavered. And Elon Musk? He didn't dance on their graves. He didn't crow victory. He simply posted 3 words to his social media account. 3 words that encapsulated everything. Accountability. Finally, beginning. No hashtags, no victory laps. Just a simple reminder that no brand, no matter how powerful, is bigger than the truth. And no legacy, no matter how carefully polished, can survive the corrosive power of reality when it finally breaches the gates. Inside the shattered remnants of the Obama Foundation's inner circle, the reckoning set in. The emails leaked, the memos surfaced, the backroom deals with corporate sponsors became public knowledge. What had been whispered in darkened rooms now blared across headlines. The Obama Presidential Center was a fraud, not just in execution, in concept. $1 billion grift wrapped in the language of justice, a golden calf built on the bones of the people it pretended to champion. And in living rooms across America, ordinary citizens watched the fall with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. Sadness for what could have been, satisfaction that, at least for once, the powerful didn't get away with it. Because Musk hadn't just challenged a construction project, he had challenged an entire system of untouchable celebrity politics. He had thrown a wrench into the gears of a machine designed to convert public trust into private profit. And for one brilliant, exhilarating moment, the machine had sputtered. In a small cafe on Chicago's South Side, an older man folded his newspaper with a grim smile. He had voted for Obama, twice, had wept when the results came in, had believed in the promise of change. Now he shook his head slowly, sipping bitter coffee. Guess some folks never really leave the system. They just learn how to sell it better. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He was awake. And across the country, millions more like him stirred from the long sleep of manufactured hope. Ready to see, ready to remember, ready finally to reckon. The wreckage wasn't immediate. It never is. Empires don't crumble in a single night. They erode, fracture by fracture, as the illusions holding them together disintegrate under the weight of truth. And the Obama legacy was no different. In the days following Musk's decisive move, the headlines shifted. No longer sanitized tributes to hope and progress. Now words like fraud, mismanagement, and betrayal splashed across the front pages. Editorial boards, once faithful, turned cold. Pundits hedged their bets, qualifying their praise with subtle jabs. Historians began rewriting early drafts, and in the backrooms of political power, the unthinkable happened. The Obamas became liabilities. Fundraisers struggled to fill seats. Surrogates hesitated to invoke the once sacred names. Book sales plateaued. Netflix deals soured quietly behind closed doors. The machine had moved on. It always does. Hope was no longer profitable. Change had a new brand manager. Progress found new faces to wear. And the old icons were left to fade into the same irrelevance they once vowed to upend. At the center of it all, the Obama Presidential Center loomed like a tombstone. Unfinished, unloved, unwanted. A billion-dollar relic to an empire built on slogans, collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The protests didn't stop. They grew. Community leaders who once genuflected before the Obamas now led marches against them. Chants echoed through the streets of Chicago. Our land, not your legacy. Stop the grift. Take it down. The very neighborhoods they claimed to champion now demanded their monuments be dismantled. It was poetic, it was brutal, and it was inevitable. Inside the Obama Foundation, the denial persisted at first. Press releases blamed misinformation. Spokespeople framed critics as conspiracy theorists and bad faith actors. But the walls continued to close. City officials, once eager to pose for photo ops, now refused their calls. Donors ghosted. Law firms cut ties. And behind the scenes, more damaging documents surfaced. Invoices padded beyond reason. Consulting firms billing 7 figures for diversity training seminars that never materialized. Environmental violations hidden under layers of red tape. The myth had not just cracked, it had collapsed into dust. Meanwhile, Elon Musk did something almost no one expected. He stepped back. He didn't gloat. He didn't weaponize the victory. He simply watched as the structure he had exposed crumbled under its own rot. Because the truth doesn't need cheerleaders. It only needs oxygen. And once the people saw, really saw, there was no going back. Across America, the reckoning deepened. It wasn't confined to Chicago. It wasn't confined to the Obamas. It spread like wildfire through every institution that had sold out hope for access, through every organization that had traded principles for power. through every politician who had wrapped themselves in the language of revolution while living the reality of privilege. The people were awake, and they were angry, not in the nihilistic rage the media loved to caricature, but in a cold, righteous fury, the fury of those who had been lied to, used, discarded, and who now finally understood. In small towns, city councils faced angry constituents demanding accountability. In schools, students questioned the narratives they had been fed without skepticism. In churches, sermons shifted from blind political worship to deeper calls for integrity. In family kitchens, late-night conversations wrestled with uncomfortable truths. The spell had broken, the illusion was dead, and in its place stood something rawer, rougher, but real. Tom Homan, watching the news one evening, simply shook his head. He had seen it coming, not because he was a cynic, but because he had spent his life on the front lines, where promises met reality and usually shattered. He sipped his coffee, black and unsweetened, and muttered to no one in particular, "About damn time." In a modest diner on the outskirts of Detroit, a waitress refilled a trucker's coffee cup. The man looked up from his newspaper, the headline blaring, "Obama Library Project Implodes Amid Fraud Allegations." He chuckled dryly. "Ain't it funny? All that hope and change turned out to be just another hustle." The waitress smiled sadly. "Guess some folks never really wanted to fix anything. They just wanted to sit at the table." Simple words, but more profound than 1,000 focus-grouped speeches. The Obamas retreated into carefully managed silence, a few stage appearances, a few curated social media posts. But the magic was gone. The applause was muted. The adulation curdled into awkward deference. They hadn't been destroyed, but they had been demystified. And in politics, demystification is death. Meanwhile, Elon Musk moved on. New ventures, new battles, new fires to light and old structures to burn down. He hadn't saved America. No one man could. But he had pulled back the curtain. He had exposed the machinery. He had reminded a complacent people that no one, no matter how polished, how praised, how protected, is above accountability. In the end, the real victory wasn't the fall of the Obama Center. It wasn't the collapse of a brand. It wasn't the public shaming of powerful hypocrites. It was the quiet awakening in the hearts of ordinary Americans. The rediscovery of an old stubborn truth. That power must always be questioned. That hope must be earned, not bought. That change is not a slogan, it is a sacrifice. And that true progress does not come from worshiping false idols. It comes from tearing them down when they betray the people they were meant to serve. As the sun set over the half-finished ruins of the Obama Presidential Center, the shadows stretched long and cold. There were no crowds, no cameras, no swelling anthems. Only the soft, persistent whisper of a nation waking up. A whisper that would grow into a roar, a reminder, a promise. Never again.